Callan had spent her life running from danger, but when she stumbled upon an entry to the trial of heirs, she decided it was time to run toward destiny instead. Welcome to our channel where we write fascinating tales of people, places, and values. Be sure to like and subscribe so that we can continue creating the stories you love. The streets of Darwin were no place for the faint-hearted. Narrow alleys crisscrossed between crumbling stone buildings, their shadows deepened by the constant haze of coal smoke rising from the docks. Merchants shouted their wares, pickpockets worked their trade, and the city guard prowled with eyes sharp for any sign of trouble. For Callan, this chaos was home. At 17, Callan had mastered the art of survival. Quick hands, quicker feet, and a knack for blending into crowds kept her out of trouble, mostly. Today, however, trouble found her in the form of an angry baker, his face red with rage as he chased her through the bustling market square. "Thief! Stop her!" the man bellowed, waving a flour-dusted rolling pin. Callan darted through the throng, clutching a warm loaf of bread. Her stomach growled in protest at the thought of dropping it, but she had no intention of being caught. She vaulted over a vegetable cart, scattering onions and carrots across the cobblestones, and slipped into an alley too narrow for the stout baker to follow. Once safely out of sight, she crouched behind a barrel, tearing into the loaf with the desperation of someone who hadn't eaten in 2 days. The taste of the crust was bliss, even if it was hard and stale. She leaned back against the damp stone wall, letting out a sigh of relief. Another day, another scrape survived. Her respite was short-lived. As she prepared to move on, her keen ears caught the faint clink of metal against stone. Curious, she shifted the barrel aside and found a small, ornate token glinting in the dim light. Intricate engravings swirled across its surface, surrounding a single unmistakable emblem, the crown of Arion. Callan's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary trinket. It was an entry token for the trial of heirs, the legendary race held once every decade to determine the kingdom's next ruler. Only the wealthiest and most powerful noble families ever participated, each sending their finest candidates to compete in the grueling event. For someone like her, a street orphan with no family name or lineage, even touching such a token felt like a crime. She turned it over in her hands, marveling at the craftsmanship. It must have been dropped by one of the nobles preparing for the race. No doubt they would pay a fortune to get it back. But as she considered her options, a thought took root in her mind, wild, impossible, and yet irresistible. What if she didn't return it? What if she used it? The very idea was absurd. She had no training, no resources, and no business standing among the heirs of Arion. Yet the more she thought about it, the more the idea refused to let go. The race was a chance, a once-in-a-lifetime chance, to escape the streets and claim a future she had never dared to dream of. And beyond that, it was an opportunity to make a difference. The kingdom's rulers had always come from the same circle of privileged elites, blind to the struggles of the common folk. What if someone like her, someone who understood what it meant to fight for every scrap, took the throne? Callan's grip tightened on the token. She had nothing to lose and everything to gain. But if she was going to do this, she had to move quickly. The trial was set to begin in 3 days, and competitors were already gathering in the capital city of Valdreth. She would need a disguise, supplies, and a way to blend in with the other entrants. The next hours passed in a blur of preparation. Callan traded her few belongings for a threadbare cloak and a pair of sturdy boots. She practiced forging the confident stride of a noblewoman, mimicking the haughty posture she had seen so often in Darwin's wealthier districts. By the time she boarded a caravan heading for Valdreth, she had shed her street rat persona, adopting the guise of a minor noble from a distant province. The journey to Valdreth was fraught with tension. Callan's heart pounded every time someone glanced her way, certain they would see through her ruse. But luck was on her side, and the caravan guards paid little attention to a quiet, unassuming traveler. When the spires of Valdreth's grand palace came into view, she felt a strange mix of awe and fear. She had made it this far, but the real challenge was only beginning. The city buzzed with excitement as nobles and their entourages prepared for the trial. Callan kept to the edges of the crowd, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Competitors ranged from polished knights to wiry athletes, each exuding confidence and strength. She felt small and out of place among them, but she refused to let her fear show. Registration was the final hurdle. Callan approached the official tent, her pulse racing as she presented the token. The clerk, a grizzled man with a bored expression, barely glanced at her before marking her name, or rather the false name she had given, on the list of entrants. She had done it. She was officially in. As she walked away from the tent, the weight of what she had just committed to began to sink in. Trial of Heirs was no simple race. It was a brutal, multi-day ordeal designed to test not only physical endurance but also cunning, courage, and the ability to command loyalty. Many competitors wouldn't survive to see the finish line. And yet, as she stood among the crowd of would-be rulers, Callan felt a spark of determination ignite within her. She had spent her entire life running, from hunger, from danger, from the hopelessness that clung to the streets of Darwin like a shadow. Now, for the first time, she was running toward something. Toward a future. Toward a crown. Whether she succeeded or failed, one thing was certain. The race of her life had begun. The day of the trial dawned with a heavy mist clinging to Valdreth's cobbled streets, muting the vibrant energy that had built in the city over the past week. Callan stood among the gathered competitors, her breath visible in the chilly morning air. The trial's starting line had been marked in the central square, where a roaring crowd of nobles and commoners alike pressed against barriers for a glimpse of the kingdom's finest, and, unbeknownst to them, a street orphan in disguise. Each competitor was flanked by attendants and adorned in personalized gear, their family crests emblazoned on their tunics. Callan's plain cloak and patched boots stood out in stark contrast, earning her skeptical glances and whispered mockery from the nearby nobles. She forced herself to stand tall, clutching the entry token hidden beneath her cloak. The buzz of conversation around her grew louder as the chancellor, a gaunt man with a voice that cut through the din, stepped onto a raised platform to address the crowd. "Lords and ladies of Arion," he intoned, "we gather today for the trial of heirs, a sacred tradition to determine the worthiest among us to ascend to the throne. Only one will claim victory. Only one will wear the crown." Crowd erupted in cheers, but Callan's focus was elsewhere. She scanned the faces of the other competitors, sizing them up. Some exuded confidence, their smiles razor-sharp and their movements calculated. Others wore grim expressions, their determination palpable. Callan knew she couldn't rely on brute strength or years of training, as many of them likely could. She would need to stay sharp, move quickly, and, above all, trust no one. The chancellor's voice brought her attention back to the platform. "This year's trial begins with the crossing of the Luminar Forest," he declared. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Callan's stomach tightened. She'd heard stories of the forest, its towering trees, its labyrinthine paths, and the dangers lurking within. "Your first task," the chancellor continued, "is to reach the western edge of the forest by nightfall. Path is not marked, and only the clever and resilient will emerge unscathed. May the gods favor the brave." With a wave of his hand, the chancellor signaled the start of the trial. The square erupted into chaos as competitors surged forward, jostling for position. Callan hesitated for a moment, overwhelmed by the crush of bodies before diving into the fray. Her slight frame allowed her to slip through gaps, avoiding the elbows and shoves that sent others sprawling. She broke free of the crowd just as they reached the outskirts of the forest. The Luminar Forest was every bit as imposing as the stories had claimed. Massive trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwined to form a dense canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. Shadows danced across the forest floor, and the air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth. Callan's instincts told her to keep moving, but she paused to assess her surroundings. Charging blindly would only get her lost, or worse. As she studied the terrain, a sharp voice cut through her thoughts. "Out of my way, urchin!" Callan turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man glaring down at her. His tunic bore the crest of House Morvain, one of the most powerful noble families in the kingdom. His face was twisted with disdain as he shoved past her, his entourage following close behind. Callan bit back a retort. Drawing attention to herself now would be a mistake. She waited until the Morvain group disappeared into the trees before setting off in a different direction. Her goal was to avoid confrontation for as long as possible. The forest was vast, and she knew she had to pace herself if she hoped to reach the western edge by nightfall. Hours passed as Callan navigated the forest's winding paths. The sounds of other competitors grew fainter, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional cry of distant animals. She used her street-honed skills to move silently, her eyes constantly scanning for threats. Her caution paid off when she spotted a snare hidden among the underbrush, its wire glinting faintly in the dappled light. She stepped carefully around it, grateful for the instincts that had kept her alive this long. As the day wore on, the forest grew darker and Callan's progress slowed. Her legs ached and her stomach growled in protest. She paused to catch her breath, leaning against a tree when a low growl sent a shiver down her spine. She turned slowly, her heart hammering, to see a pair of golden eyes gleaming from the shadows. A wolf. No, not just one, several pairs of eyes appeared, their owners stepping into view. The pack surrounded her, their movements fluid and predatory. Callan's mind raced. She had no weapon, no training in combat. Running would only provoke them. Just as the first wolf crouched to pounce, a figure burst through the underbrush, brandishing a torch. The wolves recoiled, snarling, before retreating into the shadows. Callan's rescuer turned to face her, a wiry young man with a scar running down his cheek and a crooked grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're welcome," he said, extending a hand. "Thames Yerrick. Don't suppose you'd be willing to team up?" Callan hesitated, studying him. He didn't look like the other nobles, with their polished armor and haughty airs. There was something rough around the edges about him, something familiar. Reluctantly, she took his hand. "Callan," she replied. "And I'm not big on trust." Jarek's grin widened. "Good. Neither am I." Two set off together, their uneasy alliance born out of necessity. Yerrick proved to be resourceful, guiding them through the forest with an ease that suggested he had spent time in the wilderness. As nightfall approached, they stumbled upon another competitor, a young woman with a healer's satchel and a quiet determination in her eyes. Her name was Lissa, and after some persuasion she agreed to join their group. Together, the trio reached the western edge of the forest just as the last light faded from the sky. Exhausted but alive, they collapsed onto the grass, their relief palpable. For the first time, Callan allowed herself a moment of hope. She had made it through the first leg of the trial, and she wasn't alone. But as she looked at her new allies, she couldn't shake the nagging doubt in the back of her mind. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. And in the race for the crown, alliances could shatter as quickly as they formed. The western edge of the Luminar forest offered a brief reprieve for the competitors, but the air was heavy with tension as the second leg of the trial loomed. Callan, Yerrick, and Lissa had made camp on the outskirts, away from the larger groups. The three of them were an uneasy alliance at best, united by circumstance rather than trust. Still, the relief of surviving the forest and the wolves was enough to keep them together, for now. Yerrick leaned against a tree, sharpening a knife he'd scavenged from another competitor's discarded pack. "So," he began, eyeing Callan with his usual crooked grin, "now that we've had our first taste of this delightful little game, care to tell us what your angle is? You're not exactly blending in with the noble crowd." Callan's fingers tightened around the edge of her cloak. "And you are," she shot back. Jarek's grin widened, but he didn't press further. Lissa, seated nearby and tending to a shallow cut on her arm, glanced between them. "If we're going to keep going as a group, we need to focus on what lies ahead. This trial isn't just about strength, it's about strategy." Her tone was calm but firm, and Callan couldn't help but respect the quiet authority in her voice. The following morning, the Chancellor's messengers arrived to deliver the instructions for the next leg of the trial. A weathered scroll informed the competitors that their task was to navigate the ruins of an ancient castle, once a stronghold of Arion's early rulers. The ruins were known for their treacherous terrain and rumored to hold both traps and treasures. To succeed, competitors had to retrieve a relic from the castle's depths and present it at the next checkpoint. "Sounds simple enough," Yerrick muttered as they approached the ruins. But one look at the crumbling towers and gaping chasms told Callan otherwise. Vines snaked through the jagged stones, and the air was thick with an eerie stillness. Other competitors were already scattered across the area, some cautiously exploring, others rushing headlong into the maze of rubble. Callan's street instincts kicked in as they entered the ruins. Every step felt like a gamble, the stones beneath her feet threatening to give way at any moment. Lissa took the lead, her healer's eye catching subtle details others might miss. Yerrick brought up the rear, his knife at the ready. Together they moved deeper into the ruins, their progress slow but steady. It was in a collapsed hall, half buried under centuries of debris, that they stumbled upon their first clue that something was amiss. Callan's sharp eyes caught a faint glimmer of metal beneath the dirt. She knelt to uncover it, revealing a rusted insignia bearing the emblem of the crown of Arion. The discovery seemed ordinary enough, until Lissa's face paled. "This doesn't make sense," Lissa murmured, brushing the dirt from the insignia. "This emblem is over 2 centuries old. It belonged to the original dynasty, the one that was overthrown." Yerrick frowned. And, Lissa continued, "the official records claim the dynasty's strongholds were all destroyed. There shouldn't be anything left of their symbols. This is here, it means..." Callan's mind raced, piecing together the implications. "It means someone's been hiding the truth," she finished. "But why?" Before they could dwell on the question, the sound of voices reached them. Callan motioned for silence, and the trio pressed themselves into the shadows as a group of competitors passed by. At their center was a figure Callan recognized immediately, the noble from House Morvain who had shoved past her in the forest. His entourage was smaller now, but his air of arrogance remained. The group paused near a crumbling archway, where one of Morvain's men produced a parchment map. Callan's pulse quickened as she realized what she was seeing. The map wasn't part of the trial. It was an advantage, something Morvain had brought with him to tilt the odds in his favor. "Cheating noble scum," Yerrick muttered under his breath. Callan nodded, her mind working furiously. If Morvain had a map, it might lead to more than just the relic they were supposed to retrieve. Could hold the key to uncovering the secrets buried in these ruins, and perhaps the corruption behind the trial itself. Determined to act, Callan whispered her plan to Yerrick and Lissa. They would follow Morvain's group at a distance, staying out of sight until an opportunity presented itself. The next hour was a tense game of cat and mouse, with Callan and her allies trailing their quarry through the labyrinth of the castle's lower levels. Their patience paid off when Morvain's group stopped to investigate a hidden chamber. Callan slipped closer, her heart pounding, until she was close enough to catch fragments of their conversation. "Proof of the old dynasty's claims," one of Morvain's men said. "If we find it, the current royal family will have no choice but to step down." "We're not here to play politics," Morvain snapped. "We're here to win the crown. Focus on the relic and leave the rest to me." Callan's blood ran cold. The implications were staggering. The trial of heirs wasn't just a competition, it was a facade, a carefully orchestrated game designed to maintain control over the kingdom. The relics, the ruins, even the dangers, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle. And Morvain's group wasn't the only one playing with loaded dice. The conversation was cut short when one of Morvain's men noticed Callan's shadow in the flickering torchlight. "We're not alone," he barked, drawing a sword. Callan barely had time to signal Yerrick and Lissa before the group descended on them. What followed was a chaotic scramble through the ruins, with Callan's trio narrowly avoiding capture at every turn. Despite the danger, Callan's resolve only hardened. She didn't fully understand what she had uncovered, but she knew one thing for certain: the truth had to come out. By the time they reached the checkpoint with a relic in hand, Callan's thoughts were already racing ahead to the next leg of the trial. The stakes had grown higher than she ever could have imagined, and the crown was no longer the only prize in sight. If she was going to survive, she would need to uncover the full scope of the conspiracy and decide whether she was willing to risk everything to expose it. The checkpoint marked the end of the second leg of the trial, but the air was far from celebratory. Competitors milled about the clearing, their faces etched with exhaustion and weariness. Callan, Yerrick, and Lissa sat near the edge of the camp, their breaths heavy as they examined the relic they'd retrieved from the ruins, a weathered piece of what appeared to be an ancient scepter, its surface etched with symbols Callan didn't recognize. "Looks like a chunk of junk to me," Yerrick muttered, turning the relic over in his hands. Lissa shook her head. "These symbols are significant. They're similar to what I've seen in ancient texts about the old dynasty. Whatever this is, it's tied to the throne's origins." Callan leaned closer, her brow furrowed. "If this is part of the scepter of the first king, it could prove the original dynasty's claim to the throne. That's why Morvain's group was so interested in the ruins." Yerrick scoffed. "So what? Even if you hand over proof, do you think the current king will just step aside? This trial isn't about finding the rightful ruler. It's about keeping power where it already is." His words struck a chord, but Callan didn't have time to argue. A sharp whistle pierced the air, signaling the start of the third leg. Competitors scrambled to their feet as the Chancellor's messengers unfurled the next set of instructions. "Your task," one of the messengers announced, "is to cross the Glassmere Marsh and reach the northern cliffs. The marsh is treacherous, and alliances may prove necessary. Proceed with caution." The Glassmere Marsh was infamous for its shifting terrain and thick, clinging mud. The very name evoked images of lost travelers and sunken treasures. Callan's stomach twisted as she considered the challenges ahead, but she forced herself to focus. They had come this far together, and the marsh would require every ounce of their cunning. Their journey began under a sky heavy with gray clouds, the marsh stretching before them like a sea of reeds and glistening mud. Path was unclear, and every step was a risk. Yerrick led the way, using a long branch to test the ground ahead. Lissa followed close behind, her keen eyes scanning for hidden dangers, while Callan brought up the rear, her thoughts racing. It was halfway through the marsh that the cracks in their alliance began to show. Tensions ran high as the group encountered more competitors, some willing to cooperate and others intent on sabotage. A gang of 3 nobles attempted to ambush them at a narrow crossing, forcing Callan and Yerrick to fend them off while Lissa scrambled to safety. Though they managed to drive the attackers back, the skirmish left their supplies damaged and their trust frayed. "We can't keep fighting off everyone we meet," Lissa said, her voice tight with frustration. "We need a plan." "The plan is to keep moving," Yerrick snapped. "Unless you'd rather stick around and wait for the next group to pick us off." Callan tried to mediate, but the growing tension between Yerrick and Lissa weighed heavily on her. The marsh seemed to magnify their frustrations, the endless mud and oppressive silence pressing down on all of them. By the time they reached a small patch of solid ground to rest, the strain was palpable. It was during this uneasy pause that the betrayal came. Callan woke in the dead of night to find Yerrick gone. Panic surged through her as she scrambled to check their supplies, only to find the relic missing. Her heart sank as she realized the truth. Yerrick had taken it. Lissa stirred, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. He left us," she whispered, disbelief coloring her voice. Callan clenched her fists, anger and hurt warring within her. "He didn't just leave. He took the relic." Lissa's expression darkened. "We trusted him." "You trusted him." The accusation stung, but Callan pushed it aside. "We don't have time to dwell on it. If he thinks he can win the trial alone, he's wrong. We'll find him." The remainder of their journey through the marsh was a blur of desperation and determination. Callan and Lissa moved quickly, following the faint trail Yerrick had left behind. Along the way, they encountered more dangers: unstable ground that swallowed whole sections of the path, venomous creatures lurking in the reeds, and other competitors who had no qualms about attacking them. Each challenge tested their resolve, but Callan refused to give up. Finally, as the cliffs came into view on the horizon, they spotted Yeruk. He was alone, his progress slowed by the weight of the relic and his own exhaustion. Callan's heart pounded as she and Lissa closed the distance, their footsteps muffled by the marshy ground. When they caught up to him, Yeruk barely had time to react before Callan tackled him to the ground. The relic tumbled from his grasp, landing in the mud a few feet away. Yeruk struggled, but Callan's fury gave her strength. "Why?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Why betray us?" Jarek's smirk was gone, replaced by a look of guilt and defiance. "You think this trial is about honor? It's every man for himself." "I did what I had to do." Lissa retrieved the relic, her hands trembling as she wiped the mud from its surface. "You endangered all of us," she said quietly. "For what?" "To get ahead." Yeruk didn't answer, and Callan felt her anger begin to subside, replaced by a deep, bitter sadness. She released him, stepping back as Lissa stood beside her. The three of them were silent for a moment, the weight of their choices hanging heavy in the air. "Go," Callan finally said, her voice cold. "We'll finish this without you." Yeruk hesitated, then nodded. He picked himself up and walked away without another word, his figure soon swallowed by the marsh. Callan watched him go, her chest tight with conflicting emotions. She had trusted him and he had betrayed her. But there was no time to dwell on the pain. The trial wasn't over and the stakes had never been higher. As the cliffs loomed closer, Callan and Lissa pressed on, their alliance stronger despite the betrayal. They had survived the marsh, reclaimed the relic, and learned a hard lesson about trust. Now, as they prepared for the next challenge, Callan's resolve burned brighter than ever. She would finish this race not just for the crown but for the truth hidden behind it. The northern cliffs rose like jagged teeth against the storm-gray sky, their peaks veiled by low-hanging mist. Callan and Lissa stood at the edge of the Glassmere marsh, their clothes soaked and mud-streaked, their bodies worn but unbroken. The relic lay secure in Lissa's satchel, its weight a constant reminder of the stakes. Ahead of them, the Chancellor's banner marked the entrance to the final stage of the trial, the ancient maze hidden within the mountain. Competitors gathered in small clusters, their numbers reduced by the marsh's trials. Morvain stood near the front, his arrogance undiminished despite his reduced entourage. He cast a disdainful glance in Callan's direction but said nothing. The betrayal by Yeruk had hardened Callan's resolve. She refused to be cowed by the likes of Morvain or anyone else. The Chancellor's voice rang out over the crowd, commanding attention. "Competitors, you have reached the final leg of the Trial of Heirs. Before you lies the Labyrinth of Kings, a place of both peril and revelation. To claim the crown, you must navigate its depths and retrieve the artifact at its heart. Be warned, the labyrinth has claimed many lives. Only those with courage, cunning, and wisdom will emerge victorious." Callan exchanged a glance with Lissa. They had come too far to falter now. Whatever the labyrinth held, they would face it together. The entrance to the labyrinth was carved into the mountainside, its arched doorway flanked by statues of long-forgotten kings. The stonework was ancient, weathered by time but still imposing. Callan couldn't help but feel a chill as they stepped inside, the air growing colder and heavier with each passing moment. Torches flickered along the walls, casting shadows that seemed to dance and writhe. The maze was a disorienting tangle of corridors, some wide enough for a crowd and others so narrow they had to turn sideways to pass. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the echo of their footsteps and the occasional distant sound of stone shifting, or was it something else? Lissa studied the symbols etched into the walls, her fingers tracing their patterns. "These markings," she murmured, "they're similar to the ones on the relic. They might be directions or warnings." "Either way," Callan replied, "we'll have to trust your instincts." The first trap caught them by surprise. A loose stone triggered a mechanism that sent arrows whistling through the air. Callan's reflexes saved her, but one of the arrows grazed her arm, leaving a shallow cut. Lissa pulled her to safety, her hands trembling as she applied a makeshift bandage. "We need to be more careful," Lissa said, her voice tight with fear. Callan nodded, determination etched on her face. We've made it this far. We're not stopping now. As they ventured deeper into the labyrinth, the traps grew more complex, testing not just their physical endurance but their wit and teamwork. A room filled with shifting tiles forced them to solve a riddle to proceed, while another required them to retrieve a key from a pit of venomous serpents. Each challenge left them more exhausted but also more determined. In one chamber, they encountered Morvain and his dwindling entourage. He sneered at them, his words dripping with condescension. Still clinging to hope, street rat? You're out of your depth here. Callan's eyes flashed with defiance. We'll see who's out of their depth. Morvain laughed, but it was a hollow sound. His group moved ahead, but Callan couldn't shake the feeling that he was growing desperate. Hours later, they reached the heart of the labyrinth. The final chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness. At its center stood a pedestal, upon which rested the artifact, a crown unlike any Callan had ever seen. It shimmered with an otherworldly light, its surface adorned with jewels that seemed to pulse like beating hearts. But the chamber was not unguarded. As Callan and Lissa approached, the ground trembled, and a massive figure emerged from the shadows. It was a guardian of stone and metal, its eyes glowing with an unnatural fire. The creature moved with terrifying speed, blocking their path to the crown. "Stay back!" Callan shouted as the guardian lunged. She dodged its sweeping arm, the force of its movement sending dust and debris flying. Lissa searched the room frantically, her gaze landing on an array of levers and mechanisms along the walls. "I think I can disable it," Lissa called out. "Keep it distracted." Callan didn't hesitate. She darted around the guardian, using her agility to stay one step ahead of its powerful strikes. Each movement was a gamble, her muscles screaming in protest, but she refused to back down. Meanwhile, Lissa worked feverishly, her hands flying across the controls. With a final pull of a lever, the guardian froze, its glowing eyes dimming as it sank back into the ground. The room fell silent. Callan collapsed to her knees, her chest heaving as Lissa approached the pedestal. Together they lifted the crown, its weight heavier than they expected. As they held it, a vision filled their minds, scenes of Arion's past, the rise and fall of its dynasties, and the truth behind the trial. The crown was not just a symbol of power, it was a record of the kingdom's history, a testament to the cycles of corruption and rebellion that had plagued Arion for centuries. Callan's grip tightened on the crown. "This trial isn't about finding a ruler," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's about maintaining control. The crown, it's a tool to keep the people divided, to make them believe in a lie." Lissa's eyes filled with tears. "Then we have to do something. We can't let this continue." Callan nodded, her resolve solidifying. The trial was far from over, but they had uncovered its true purpose. Now they had to decide how to use that knowledge, and whether they were willing to risk everything to bring the truth to light. The final leg of the trial ended not with cheers but with silence. Callan and Lissa stood at the labyrinth's exit, the crown heavy in their hands and their hearts heavier still. The truth they had uncovered within the labyrinth's depths burned brightly in their minds. The trial of heirs was a facade, a carefully orchestrated tradition designed to preserve the existing power structure at the expense of truth and justice. To Callan, the crown no longer represented victory. It was a weapon, one that could shatter the foundations of the kingdom or reinforce its chains. As they emerged into the daylight, the gathered crowd erupted into a roar. Competitors who had failed to reach the artifact stood in tense clusters, their expressions a mix of awe and resentment. At the forefront of the assembly stood the Chancellor, his gaunt face unreadable as his eyes fell upon Callan. She felt the weight of his gaze, but she refused to falter. This moment was hers. "The trial of heirs has concluded," the Chancellor announced, his voice cutting through the cacophony. "Present the artifact." Callan stepped forward, the crown cradled in her hands. Every eye was on her, and the tension was palpable. She glanced at Lissa, who nodded, her expression a mixture of resolve and trepidation. Callan took a deep breath and held the crown aloft. "This," she began, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her, "is more than a crown. It is a symbol of a broken system, a lie perpetuated for centuries to keep power in the hands of the few. The trial of heirs is not a test of worthiness. It is a charade." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The Chancellor's calm demeanor cracked, his eyes narrowing as he took a step forward. "Careful, girl," he said, his tone sharp. "You tread on dangerous ground." "The ground has always been dangerous," Callan shot back, her voice rising. "For those of us who live in the streets, who fight for every scrap, who have no family crest to protect us. This crown doesn't belong to the nobility. It belongs to the people." A murmur of agreement began to spread through the crowd. Callan's words struck a chord, igniting a spark of rebellion in the hearts of the gathered commoners. She stepped down from the platform, the crown still in her hands, and turned to face the crowd directly. "I didn't come here to claim the throne," she continued. "I came here to change what it means to lead. To show that the strength of a kingdom lies not in its rulers but in its people. If you believe in a future where every voice matters, then stand with me." For a moment there was only silence. Then a single voice called out, "I stand with you." The declaration was followed by another and another, until the square echoed with a growing chorus of support. The Chancellor's protests were drowned out as the crowd surged forward, their unity a force that could not be ignored. The days that followed were a whirlwind. News of Callan's defiance spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the kingdom. The trial of heirs had always been a spectacle, but now it was the spark of a revolution. Commoners began to rise up, demanding accountability from the nobles who had long exploited them. The relics retrieved during the trial became symbols of the people's power, proof that the past could no longer be hidden. Callan, with Lissa by her side, became the face of the movement. Together, they navigated the treacherous waters of rebellion, forging alliances with sympathetic nobles and rallying the oppressed. The road was not easy. Morvain and others like him fought tooth and nail to maintain their grip on power, and the revolution was marked by moments of loss and sacrifice. But the people's determination was unyielding. They marched on the capital, their numbers swelling with every village and town they passed. By the time they reached Valdreth, the city was a sea of voices demanding change. Callan stood at the forefront, the crown held high as a beacon of hope. The final confrontation took place in the grand hall of the palace. King, flanked by his advisors and a dwindling number of loyal guards, faced Callan and her allies with a mixture of anger and fear. The Chancellor's voice was tight as he demanded order, but the will of the people could not be silenced. Callan stepped forward, her voice ringing clear. "This kingdom belongs to all of us. If you truly wish to lead, then do so with the people's trust and not through fear and deceit. But if you cannot, then step aside." King's answer came not in words but in action. He rose from his throne and placed the ceremonial scepter at Callan's feet. "The kingdom is yours," he said, his voice weary. "Do what I could not." In the days that followed, a new council was formed, one that included voices from every corner of Arion. Callan refused the title of queen, instead becoming a leader among equals. Lissa became her closest advisor, her wisdom guiding the delicate process of rebuilding. Crown, once a symbol of oppression, was placed in the Hall of Memory, a reminder of the kingdom's past and the cost of its future. Callan's name became a legend, not as a ruler but as a symbol of hope and resilience. And so the kingdom of Arion began its greatest journey, not one of conquest but of unity, guided by the simple truth that the strength of a kingdom lies in its people. Thank you for sticking around until the end. Again, if you enjoyed the story, remember to like and subscribe and share this video with your loved ones.